live?
Yeah. How
Perfect.
are we? I didn't know that.
Oh, we're live.
Glad I didn't name what it was.
Yeah, we didn't name names. We didn't even name the parish. Oh, Father James, you and I have been batting this idea back and forth a while.
Yes, it's battered.
Yes. What explains Hitler's early successes, both inside his own country and then later on some of his military successes?
We've got four categories. Um, there's his success in taking over the party,
Okay.
which he didn't found. And his success, if this can be said respectfully, right? I mean, it's such a dangerous topic because he is the most easily, instantly recognizable, and rightly so, recognizable villain. But of course, uh, the villainy of his regime, well, would not have amounted to anything if they hadn't accomplished certain successes.
Sure.
And you don't have successes without having certain abilities. So one is instantly cautious with this subject because one does not wish to sound as though one were praising this character.
Hmm.
However, he would not have been a menace or a danger had he not possessed certain talents and taken advantage of certain opportunities.
Indeed. And
So,
recognize certain moments. And
yes, seize the advantage of certain moments and to see the opportunity and to seize it. That calls for a certain amount of intelligence of a certain kind, calls for some boldness of a certain kind, some initiative. Uh, so with this subject, keep coming back to the principle, the basic moral philosophical principle that evil is not an essence, it is not a substance, it is not a thing, it is not an entity. Evil is the word we use to describe the absence of what ought to be there. Uh, Thus, in talking about the devil, we're not talking about an abstract principle of evil. We're talking about an entity who threw away some things that should be there. The qualities that remain are good in themselves, but they are twisted by the absence of other qualities, the absence of mercy, the absence of love, the absence of hope, the absence of faith, etc. Um, it's a basic principle. So, no criminal in history, no tyrant in history, however tyrannical, however criminal, is in history without having had some good qualities, the good qualities that made him dangerous. You don't have Attila the Hun being the terror of Europe without him being courageous, energetic, aggressive, clever. So, am I praising Attila the Hun? I'm saying as a human being who became a terrible human being and did awful things. So, similarly, in the case of the 20th century's far from the only villain, far from the only terrible villain of the 20th century, but easily the most recognizable and the largest villain. In his case, you have to recognize success, 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 failure, failure, failure.
mm,
So why was there this ascent? And why was there this dramatic, stunning decline? Successes first.
I hate to interrupt you. Just turn your mic a little bit and just point it a little bit more there, and then just lift the. There you go. Perfect.
Okay. So first, the success in taking over the party. That perhaps wasn't too impressive. It was what would have seemed to most people like a collection of weird misfits. Uh, but if you're dealing with weird misfits, you're dealing with some stubborn, cranky personalities. And to persuade the majority of those stubborn, cranky personalities to accept you as the leader unconditionally, this is in its way an impressive thing. More impressive to steer this small party far from the mainstream, to steer it to political success.
I think you said they had less than 3% of the vote.
Less than 3% of the vote in 1928. more than 30% of the vote in the next election. Was that just the Great Depression? Wouldn't have happened without the Great Depression, but he clearly successfully seized his moment. So control the party and bringing that party to political victory. And then accomplishing a series of diplomatic and strategic bloodless successes that established his Germany as the leading power of Europe. All these before we come to the war. My contention, it's a fairly strong contention, is that there's more than one moral flaw in the man, right?
Mm-hmm.
More than one. But his essential moral flaw was a predisposition to violence. He wanted a war. So the path of diplomatic success, which was quite extraordinary, was not the path he wanted to follow. He eventually got the war he wanted. And he won it. What John Lukács calls the last European war. The other two European powers, the other two strictly European powers, are defeated and crushingly defeated. Britain resisted invasion because, as one French general irked at the English saying, "Yeah, why are you surrendering?" It's easier for you to say, the English Channel is a marvelous anti-tank ditch. So England was defeated, held out, was defeated, driven from the continent. France was conquered. So the last European war was a victory. But he didn't know what to do with that victory and didn't know how to make peace. Didn't know how to make peace because he could not accept the idea of peace being based on anything other than domination by his Germany. And the rest of the world was not going to accept that.
There was a moment in time in which Hitler could have settled, been the dominant power in Europe, and France would have been in a tertiary position.
Yes.
Spain,
Well,
hardly negligible.
not negligible, but very, very much a third tier power.
And then Russia.
He expected Britain to make peace, but at this point it was understood. Well, what he didn't realize is that the price of peace was German domination of Europe, and that was an unacceptable price. So Britain would resist, and at some point, he didn't know when, at some point the Soviet Union, which had been his partner in crime,
Yes.
In the partitioning of Central Europe, at some point the Soviet Union also was not going to accept German domination of Europe, and the United States, the super heavyweight in the neighborhood in the world, was not going to accept German domination of Europe. So yet could he have had peace at that point, at the peak? Yes, but only if he had been other than who he was.
He couldn't stop.
He couldn't stop. Not in that respect, not unlike Napoleon before him, he couldn't stop. Nothing short of domination. But the world did not accept domination. And against the coalition, I argue the inevitable coalition of Britain, the Soviet Union, the United States, they could not prevail. So the failure was built into the success, or rather flowed directly from it. Control the party, leading the party to power, series of bloodless diplomatic successes that put Germany in domination of Central Europe. Successful war, again, John Lukács' phrase, the last European war. Victorious. What now? What now?
Sorry, this John Lucas?
Lukács, Anglo-Hungarian historian of whom I am fond.
Lukács.
Yes.
Okay. Basically claimed that Hitler fought the last European war, which was then immediately followed by the real Second World
The
War.
real Second World. Britain and
Yeah.
France had been defeated, but the Soviet Union and the United States were yet to enter the field. Now, Hitler invaded the Soviet Union. He invaded it because he realized that one of them was going to invade the other. Uh, the Soviet Union, in the long run, was not going to accept. It was giving signs it was not going to accept German domination of
Of
Europe.
Europe.
The United States, in the long run, was not going to accept German domination of Europe. So he had the idea of taking out the Soviet Union, as movie villains like to say, one swift stroke.
Hitler could have settled for Germany being a light heavyweight on the world stage. Is that true to say?
I'll put it more than that. Germany was already a light heavyweight on the world stage.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, he could have settled it for. Could have settled. He couldn't have. It wasn't who he was. A German regime,
Hmm.
a hypothetical German regime, in that position could have settled for the position of being heavyweight, strongest power in Europe, stronger than Britain, really. The British Empire didn't look like it on the map. There's still an awful lot of red in the world,
Uh-huh.
but the British Empire was headed downward. Uh, Events in India were already making it clear that the crown, the jewel in the imperial crown, was going to slip out. Uh, and that was even before the Japanese offensive. Uh, that
Into China?
Japanese offensive in Southeast Asia
Southeast Asia.
that inflicted upon the British the completely humiliating defeat of Malaya and Singapore, uh, and drove through Southeast Asia into India. It was the end of the British Empire as a global force. I mean, Britain continued to be very active and crucial in the Second World War, but as the saying goes, the writing was on the wall. In a sense, even though the United States entered relatively late, the United States was the real obstacle because of our size, because of our position, strategically invulnerable. We were the super heavyweight. And the final obstacle to Hitler's impossible dream of Germany being a global hegemon. So already it was a light heavyweight.
Ah.
After that victory, a hypothetical German regime could have accepted being a heavyweight. But not this German regime.
But not this German regime.
Did not know how to make peace. Did not know how to make peace.
Did not know how to draw compromises that everyone could buy
Right.
into.
The rest of the world has to be able to live with it.
Okay.
That the rest of the world can live with.
Mm.
You can't dictate a peace to the whole world.
Right. At some point, they have to buy in.
At some point, they have to buy in.
Where did Hitler get buy-in between 28 and 32 to go to increase his popular support tenfold for his party?
Yeah,
I mean, he was getting buy-in at some point.
yes.
What was his platform? What was his message? Germany can be great again?
You're being provocative. Yes. It's interesting to look at his speeches. At that stage in his career, there's a definite trajectory to his abilities.
Mm-hmm.
So the political tactician of 28 to 33
Okay.
is an altogether different figure from the raving lunatic of 44 to 45.
Yeah.
Never a good man. Never a good man. But he wasn't always a raving lunatic.
Yeah.
Obviously, a raving lunatic wouldn't have come to power. But the political tactician of 28 to 32, he understood that he never got a straight out majority in the elections, but he understood. He never got a straight up majority because so it came close, but most Germans had other primary commitments, uh, perhaps religious, uh, perhaps ideological. Religious, the Catholics were the backbone of the Catholic Center Party. The ideological communists, the Communist Party. Social, the old working class, the backbone of the Social Democratic Party in those days. But he was able to gather close to a majority, by far the leading party,
Hmm.
by appealing to some things that the majority of Germans regarded as almost self-evidently true. Uh, one, loathing for the Versailles settlement. Sure way for him to have a successful speech was talking about that. That was unanimously loathed. Um,
As well, it should have been.
it was a poorly Henry Kissinger, in his book Diplomacy, described the Versailles settlement as, his words, structurally unsound. And it was. It was poorly conceived. Uh, it, in particular, it humiliated Germany without really weakening Germany. In other words, it wiped out the German merchant marine, took away German colonies, chopped off some territory, but essentially the strength of Germany remained. In the conditions of that time and place, Germany was inherently a light heavyweight, but a light heavyweight who had been gratuitously humiliated, in particular the war reparations. Uh, the war reparations, the Americans, the Dawes Plan, we thought we were doing a good thing. We came up with a plan that would stretch out the reparations, make them less burdensome to Germany, stretch them out into the 1980s. Uh, but that came across as just an additional humiliation that grandchildren will have to be having their face rubbed in the dirt. Yeah, so it's a resentment about that. That was bound to appeal to almost any audience in Germany. The Versailles Treaty was loathed, uh, therefore overturned some of its provisions. We're not paying the reparations anymore. Oh, that would get the crowd going. We're not paying the reparations anymore. We're not accepting an unreasonable limit of 100,000 in the size of our army. We're not accepting anymore not being allowed to have an air force. We can't defend ourselves with an army of only 100,000. Now, of course, you'd build it to much more than that, right?
Hmm.
But you can see how this would get people excited. And it was not an unreasonable argument. Uh,
By the late 1930s, it was 800 or
yes, yes.
900,000.
Uh, which was larger than was needed for self-defense. But 100,000 was
Laughable.
absurd. And no Air Force, and no tanks, uh, and almost no Navy. We're not going to accept this anymore. Oh, the crowd would go wild. We're being told that we can't station German troops on German soil,
Mm.
the Rhineland. They're forbidden to put German troops in the Rhineland. We're not going to accept this, being told that we can't put our own in our own territory. We're not accepting this.
So the Rhineland was occupied and almost entirely by ethnic Germans,
Oh,
and it
absolutely.
was considered within the bounds of Germany.
Oh, legally, yes.
But you just can't put troops there.
Yes.
That does sound ridiculous on the face of it.
Yes. This is because the French were traumatized by World War One, naturally enough.
Hmm.
But again, Kissinger's phrase, structurally unsound. At some stage, some German government of some stripe was inevitable. At some stage, some German government would say, "To hell with this," and France would have to choose war basically on its own, because British politicians had to get public approval for going to war, and maybe a French politician could get that for keeping the Germans out of their own Rhineland, but a British politician, going to his constituents and saying, we need to fight to keep the Germans from putting German troops in Germany. Uh, People wouldn't go for this.
Right.
Well, sooner or later, this is going to fall. Eventually, any German government was going to do it, but Hitler was able to claim the credit for it. It was sort of a prize the Allies handed him.
Hmm.
Uh, other provisions like the absurd free city of Danzig, uh, Gdansk today. Uh,
It was administered by the League of Nations.
it was supposedly a free city. It didn't want to be a free city. It wanted to be part of Germany, but the Allies had declared that Poland needed an outlet to the sea. So that meant you had to have this complicated arrangement about Danzig that was an ongoing resentment. It's a German city, which it was in those days, right? Uh, Populations in Europe have been shifted, significantly shifted in the course of the trauma of the Second World War and afterward. Uh, so that was a point that was going to get the crowd happy. We're going to deal with the economic problem. We're not going to go down the road of socialism. The crowd would be very happy about that. Socialism wasn't popular, but capitalism has also failed. And if you're talking in the middle of the Great Depression, it sure looked like capitalism had failed. Uh, what we're going to offer is an alternative. Is a little unclear, loud and clear about what that alternative would be. But people like the idea. We're not socialists, we're not going to follow that road, but capitalism uh, is not the way to go either. It has failed us, it has let us down. It promised prosperity. And look at this, an impoverished working class, a middle class that had just begun to recover from the catastrophe of the great inflation.
I don't know much about that. Can you expand on that a little
Oh,
bit? The great inflation of the Weimar Republic,
the Weimar Republic. Oh,
when the mark went from like people were paying for loaves of bread with barrels full of
with
cash.
barrels full of cash.
Cash.
Yes.
Yeah.
Or if you were paid in the morning,
Hmm.
your money would have appreciably devalued by the afternoon.
Hmm.
Uh, it wiped out the savings, of course.
Sure.
Everyone's savings are rendered insignificant. Uh, Crushed the middle class. So, at the time of the Great Depression, the middle class had just begun to recover from that catastrophe. Then the Great Depression hits. Enough of this globalization. What has it done for us? We got dragged in the Depression that started in the United States because of this global system. Now, economists would argue that this is a very simplistic view, but it was an attractive view.
And it's a view that people can comprehend because it's simplistic.
Yeah, simplistic, and they can certainly see that, yes, this weird thing that seems to have started in the United States has somehow dragged us down. So, being this interconnected with the rest of the world, what has it actually done for us? It had a certain appeal and a real appeal. Uh, as far as the anti-Semitism goes, it was no secret. It was no secret. He didn't conceal it. He didn't apologize for it. But that was not the main thrust of what he presented to his audiences. Now, that meant the audience was willing to overlook that and to some degree accept it. It's safe to say that anti Semitic notions with varying degrees of intensity, with varying degrees of virulence, were widespread.
In
But
all of Europe,
yes,
but
uh,
Germany especially.
that's an interesting question. If you'd gone to someone in 1912, I'll say 1914, gone to someone in 1914 and say, within 30 years, a great nation in Europe will make a serious attempt to kill every Jew on the continent. Because if you said that to someone in 1914, they would have guessed Russian.
Russia.
Yeah, that's what you would have guessed. Uh, the pogroms against Jewish communities in Russia were in the news, and they're very real. They wouldn't have guessed Germany. Uh, so I don't think that they were more widespread, my opinion, that they were not more widespread in Germany, but they were there, as they were in other places in Europe. And the moral dislocation of war and revolution uh, allowed them to move from under the table to on top of the table. Still, most people were not ready to swallow that as a main platform. And at that stage in his career, he was cunning enough to realize that. He was dead serious about it.
Oh,
Dead serious about it. Even then, at that stage in his career, he was rational enough to know that having that front and center was not going to help him come to power. It was there. It was there. But he was careful not to make it front and center. That was not the meat and potatoes of his speeches.
understood. So you could say that one of the things that explains Hitler's successes was his early on, he had the ability to know what his audience was ready to hear.
Oh, yes. He could read his audience. He knew his audience. Um, that ability declined steadily. Once he came to power, that may be a natural effect of being in power.
That you're isolated from your
Exactly.
constituency.
And he chose to become more isolated. Uh, so again, you can tell I like him. Lukács, he makes the point in the duel. The duel is the book, the short book, where he talks about that time between the fall of France and Hitler's invasion of the Soviet Union, when it was just Britain and Germany, sort of Churchill versus Hitler. It was during that time, that exactly during that time, that Hitler faded from the German people. He stopped making public appearances. Even broadcasts became increasingly rare. So at the very time that Churchill had been talking all his life, but this is the phrase when he found his voice. The speeches that people remember from this era, the very time that Churchill found his voice with a capital V, that's the very time that the voice of Hitler faded. Uh, and I think that's also the time when you cross the line from him being mostly rational, never a good man. I'm going to repeat that. I think that's when you cross the line from him being mostly rational to mostly irrational.
And this is 1938?
No, 1940.
1940. Okay.
That 40-41,
Yeah.
that period between the fall of France and his invasion of the Soviet Union. Even at his prime, he would have had a hard time making an acceptable peace. But at this point, he was past his prime. Uh, deteriorating rapidly, physically, and I think deteriorating rapidly physically and psychologically. At this point, he just couldn't do it. There were a few people willing to try and push him in that direction, including his strange deputy Führer Rudolf Hess with his odd flight to Britain.
Push him in what
In
direction?
the direction of making a reasonable peace.
Let's make, okay.
The rest of the world will not accept German dominance of Europe. They'll accept Germany being the strongest power in Europe. That's just a fact right now. They'll accept German domination of Central Europe. That's a fact right now. Not going to accept German domination of Europe. You can't stay in France forever, in particular. There's to be some sort of restoration of France. That would have been the voice of reasonable peacemaking. That wasn't going to happen.
There was no lieutenant capable of really pushing him in that direction all the way.
Correct. Even those who might see the need for it, only addled Rudolf Hess in his warped sort of way tried to make it happen with that strange flight to Britain without telling his boss what he was up to and being addled without really being able to explain what he was up to.
Right. Wow.
But he desperately wanted peace made with Britain. But it needed to be a peace Britain and the rest of the world could live with.
Yep. Okay. Interesting. All right. So he's able to rise in his party. Then he's able to raise himself and his party in Germany through a message that was largely based on things that many people could fully agree with or fundamentally agree with.
That most people would basically agree with. That didn't mean they're all going to vote for him.
Hmm.
Some of them would think, well, yeah, we agree with this, but look at these other things. But that was important. At that stage in his career, he could understand, again, at that stage in his career, basically rational. He could understand that you can't force 50% of the German population to follow you. So once you come to power, they have to be willing to follow you. So even if they didn't vote for him, that those messages they basically approved of, even if they saw other things that disturbed them enough that they voted in another direction, that would make them willing to give him a chance once he came to office. Just the restoration of German pride, German dignity, the breaking of the Versailles settlement, which was loathed in any case, um, and following neither socialism nor capitalism, but some vague third way. It was vague, but there were lots of people who hated socialism, and there were lots of people who had given up on capitalism.
Gotcha. Now, he was elected chancellor in 1930,
January 1933.
1933. But then
Yes.
he was able to gather to himself a number of other political positions,
Yes.
all under him or all under as himself. Okay, can we just track some of those real quickly? How was he able to get more and more of the German government placed squarely on his shoulders?
Uh, that's an interesting question. The German right, the normal right, I don't know how to put this. This I'm reluctant. People normally conventionally describe the Nazis as far right. I think that somewhat misses the point. Just as it somewhat misses the point to call Soviet communism far left. They're sui generis. Uh, they use some rightist themes, but uh, the Nazis use some rightist themes, just as the communists use some leftist themes. But the communists and the Nazis both were far too committed to military bureaucratic nationalism to be accommodated in either standard left or right. They were very committed to military bureaucratic nationalism. Uh, and the German right failed to understand how different they were. The German right was sentimental about German traditions. Uh, I don't mean that. I don't mean to be slighting about that. The traditional religion, traditional culture, because the Nazis used the language of patriotism so aggressively. They thought that they're just a more extreme version of us, but they weren't a more extreme version of us. They were something different
Ah,
in terms of an extreme commitment to military bureaucratic nationalism, and of course, in terms of their quite serious racism, a quite serious racism that was focused on a deadly earnest anti-Semitism. Deadly earnest. I think that's one thing that people had a hard time grasping. Uh, any case, so coalition arrangements. That's what they thought they were making, another coalition. As you know, Germany had run on the base of coalition governments, different parties involved. The leading party gets the chancellor, but then other cabinet positions are distributed.
the chancellor would have been equivalent to a prime minister. Okay.
Then there was, of course, the president. From the point of view of the German right, the president was sort of an ersatz Kaiser. Until we get a Kaiser again, the president will do. And the president was an aging World War I general, Paul von Hindenburg. Aging.
Was in his 80s.
Oh, yes.
Oh.
Um, so Hitler got the chancellorship as head of the leading party. Other people from different parties, some people who didn't have a party commitment, got other cabinet posts. A right-wing lightweight uh, von Papen was made vice chancellor. So by normal rules, uh, this did not immediately look like dictatorship.
Ah,
By normal rules, there was not a proper appreciation of the fact the Nazis had no intention of playing by normal rules. Uh, the right collaborated, passing through the Reichstag with presidential approval, an enabling act that they used to purge the Reichstag of communists and socialists. And after that purge, that meant the Nazis had it, with those members removed, the Nazis had an absolute majority. Another election was called in which socialists, communists were not allowed to participate. That gave the Nazis their majority. A not quite honest election, since certain parties are not allowed on the ballot. They used that to they used their new majority to push through a series of laws that effectively wiped out what people thought had been the German Constitution. So, for example, the various state governments were absorbed into the national government.
so federal power increased
Federal power increased
greatly.
hugely. State governments are gone. You have, the bureaucratic structure even was revised so that the historic state boundaries no longer operated. And you had the abolition of all other parties. So it becomes
What year is that?
in the course of 33, moving into 34.
So it's quick.
It's quick.
Abolition of all of the
All the
parties.
Only one party. Now, you still had a president, albeit an aging president, with a shaky grip on reality, all of which is a little too close for comfort. The story goes that January 30th, 1933, the night of Hitler's inauguration, so to speak, as chancellor, there was a parade. And the regular army was in the parade, marching smartly. And in front of the regular army were marching smartly with their gray uniforms. And in front of the regular army, there were the stormtroopers with their brown uniforms. The stormtroopers, the party kind of militia. With
Thugs?
Yeah. They started out as bouncers, basically, the party bouncers. Make sure that other people don't disrupt the rallies. Street fighters originally. Their brown uniforms, but not marching so smartly. Brown was the color of the Russian army in World War I. The story is that poor old von Hindenburg, in a moment of confusion, turned to the defense minister and said how well your troops march and what a wonderful collection of prisoners they have. In any case, the final obstacles to dictatorship were the presence of all these other people in the cabinet who were not Nazis, most prominently the vice chancellor von Papen, and of course the existence of the president aging and decaying von Hindenburg. Um, as the stormtroopers in particular misbehaved, the right, the German right elements of the cabinet of the coalition decided it was time to try and rein things in. So there's tension, as yeah, Hitler knows perfectly well that the other groups in the cabinet will try, the other people in the cabinet will try to rein him in. And their wedge for doing this is widespread popular concern. People voted to some degree for law and order, and you have these stormtroopers rampaging through the streets, beating up people, of course, roughing up Jews, but also roughing up former political opponents, roughing up everyone who bothered them. Some of the more fanatical ones attacking Christian processions because the more fanatical ones rejected Christianity as being tainted by Judaism. Uh, People are getting alarmed about the misbehavior, the murderous misbehavior of the stormtroopers, the party thugs who are now on top of the world, they think.
Of
So
course.
that's going to be the wedge that other elements in the government will use to try and bring the Nazis under control, because the public opinion is not pleased. And it's beginning to turn. Simultaneously, the army is worried because the chief of staff of the stormtroopers in this room is talking about the stormtroopers being the nucleus of a new German army, which is not music to the ears of the old German army. They're not going to stand for this. So the army is getting unhappy. Meanwhile, Rum is thinking, as chief of staff of the stormtroopers, I should have a stronger voice.
What was his name again?
Ernst Rum.
Ernstrom.
Yes.
Okay.
Um, so, murky episode to this very day, the Night of the Long Knives, murky episode. Historians love to debate about it. To what extent was Hitler perhaps manipulated by Goering, Himmler, and Goebbels into turning against his comrade, his old comrade from early party days, Ernst Röhm? To what extent was Hitler aware of what he was doing? Because for him to solidify power, the stormtroopers had to be brought under control. The public was unhappy. The army was unhappy. Was it his idea? Or was it put before him by the sinister minds of Goering and Goebbels, Goering and Himmler and Goebbels, that you could get two birds with one stone, to use an English saying, crack down on the stormtroopers who are getting too big for their brown bridges, and simultaneously deal with these conservative elements that are starting to get rebellious. That's what he did, Night of the Long Knives. He dispatched this smaller organization, originally the bodyguards, the SS. They were used to arrest and then execute without trials, was essentially murder, the top leadership of the stormtroopers, but also they were used to eliminate key voices among the conservatives, including an ex-chancellor, which is somewhat amazing. And poor old vice chancellor von Papen, because his speechwriter and press secretary had convinced him to make a speech at Magdeburg in which he called for the end of lawless behavior. And everybody in his audience knew, and the audience, a German academic audience, they stood up and clapped. They knew what he meant. End to lawlessness meant behavior of the stormtroopers. Well, when Papen was put in his place, he was put under house arrest. But the really scary thing, his press secretary was shot dead in his office. And then his speechwriter was arrested and then, as they like to say, shot while trying to escape. So when Papen was scared, that ended his activity. He resigned as vice chancellor and became ambassador to Turkey.
So all of a sudden, there was no one to resist
No one to resist.
Hitler.
Only the army could have. And crucially, the army decided it was going to go along with this, despite the fact that General von Schleicher, despite the fact that a general, former chancellor, was one of the victims, the army went along with it.
On the thought that
They were happy that the stormtroopers getting crushed.
they didn't realize that the SS was going to.
In the long run, the SS would be a problem, but for now, Hitler promised, and he probably meant it. At this point, he and the army were simpatico with each other. This would change. He and the army leadership were simpatico with each other, and this would change. But he promised the army leadership that they were going to be the army, the established army would be the sole military force. You weren't going to have this party militia anymore. The army went along with it. So at that point, neither long eyes, Germany entered dictatorship. Little more than a year into his reign.
So this is like November of 34?
No, earlier in 34.
Earlier. Okay.
Spring.
Spring.
January 33, he comes to power. So a little over a year. Dictatorship begins. The last restraint is the existence of the president, who theoretically, not today, but in the older German constitution, the president had real powers, theoretically. And theoretically could veto legislation, theoretically could emit emergency decrees, theoretically could dismiss the chancellor, theoretically. So Hitler always had to worry about that. He was very respectful to von Hindenburg. When he met him, he'd always shake his hand and bow his head. But he could afford to be because he's an old man.
He didn't really understand what was going on in his own country anymore.
He didn't, and he wasn't going to be around for very long. Once von Hindenburg died, Hitler assumed the role of president with the approval of a tame Reichstag, now a one-party Reichstag.
Which was a popular referendum?
No, just approval of, no, the Reichstag, the parliament.
The parliament, okay.
Tame parliament, one party. So now he was president and chancellor, as well as a leader or a Führer of the party. And it was customary to use the party title. So the leader, the Führer. At that point, the dictatorship was established. And too late, later on, people in the army would begin to wonder about, what are we going to do about this? His break with the army began over Czechoslovakia. He had accomplished other foreign policy objectives.
Placing troops in the Rhineland.
Placing troops in the Rhineland, because in the end, France is unwilling to go to war over this without Britain, and British politicians are in an impossible position. Their constituency, still recovering from World War I, was not eager for further big wars. Well, how can you present this? We're going to go to war to prevent the Germans from putting German troops in Germany. This is not a political winner. So put German troops in the Rhineland, the Saarland. Hitler insisted. The French kind of wanted to keep it, or at least make sure it wasn't part of Germany. But Hitler insisted, let them vote. Who can object? Let them vote. Do you want to be part of Germany or part of France? Germany. So Saarland voted for Germany. It was overwhelmingly ethnic German. Everybody knew it was going to happen. Another easy victory for him. Um, then defying the Treaty of Versailles, the army is going to grow to more than 100,000. We're going to have an air force again. We're going to have an air force again. We're going to have a navy again. Uh,
Who can really say no to this?
we're going to say no. Germany should be able to defend itself.
We know that that previous administration of our own country was punitive in their construction of Versailles. So are we really going to enforce what we know was a poorly conceived
Very poorly.
settlement? It wasn't even a treaty.
Yeah, it was a dictated treaty. It wasn't negotiated. It ignored a key rule, not a moral rule, but a practical rule that Machiavelli expressed. I'll paraphrase Machiavelli. If you defeat your enemy, you either kill him or make friends of him. Make friends with him. What you do not do is simply humiliate him.
Hmm.
And if you can't kill him, you better make friends with him. But if you simply humiliate him, you're going to have trouble in the future. Well, that's Versailles in a nutshell. Germany remained basically strong, basically a light heavyweight, which is to say, stronger than France, just as strong as Britain. Uh, in real terms, economic terms, social terms, population terms, uh, especially as the British Empire began to disintegrate. Uh, so, yeah, we're going to let them assume kind of their natural role. Easy victories for him that build up his popularity. So you no longer have, it's still a repressive regime, right? You have people being arrested for political crimes. Uh, you have a slowly escalating program of anti-Semitism. Didn't come in all at once, but slowly, steadily escalating. It's still an unpleasant regime, but you don't have the SA beating up people in the streets every day. You don't have the SA, the stormtroopers. You
Hmm.
don't have the stormtroopers running their own private prisons. You don't have these obnoxious people lording it over you in the streets anymore. They've been tamed.
Things actually seem to get better.
Seems yes. And there are these foreign policy successes. Other governments didn't do it. I think they would have eventually, but the fact is, uh, it happened under Hitler.
In the right place at the right
Right
time.
place, the right time. Foreign policy successes because the Western Allies don't want to fight about them because the Western Allies recognized we're not in good grounds about these. We're not in good grounds at all. Uh, even, I can say this carefully, even Austria, once the Austrian Empire was broken up, this is an identity crisis for Austrians. Who are we now? Uh, and for many Austrians, including Hitler, who was Austrian by birth, for many Austrians, the answer was, well, if the empire's gone, I guess we're Germans. That was the answer for many.
An entirely German-speaking nation.
Yeah, yes. So political crisis in Austria, manipulated by the Nazis, a little bit of political force, but in the end, no resistance. A little bit of military force, just a little. In the end, no resistance, because it's what a lot of Austrians are thinking anyway. Not all, by no means all, but enough.
I think I heard somewhere that as German troops rolled into Austria, they were actually greeted enthusiastically by many crowds.
Oh, yes.
Okay.
After World War One, Austria was told produce a constitution. And the constitution they produced was instantly vetoed by the Allies. The constitution they produced was very short, sweet, and simple. Austria is part of the German nation. So this identity crisis, who are we now that the empire is gone? Well, I guess we speak German. I guess we're German.
All right.
So that didn't, Italy had to be persuaded to cooperate. But increasingly, Mussolini, to the horror of Pope Pius XI, increasingly Mussolini was drifting towards Hitler anyway. So once Hitler made it clear he wasn't going to try to change the Italian-Austrian border, again, at this stage in his career, he was capable of being flexible. So World War One, at the end of World War One, some German-speaking territory, South Tyrol, was annexed to Italy.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, at this stage in his career, Hitler was capable of being pragmatic and saying, okay, Italy gets to keep South Tyrol.
Because Italy's our friend.
Italy's our friend because Italy's not going to fight about Austria. Well, what are Britain and France going to do? Are they going to fight for a country that doesn't particularly feel like fighting for itself because it's not sure that it is a country by itself? Identity crisis. So again, easy victory for him. Czechoslovakia is a different issue, though.
Okay, so we got the Rhineland, the Saarland, then Austria. One.
The revision of Versailles,
Mm-hmm.
so remilitarization, a real army again with tanks, more than 100,000 men, an air force again, a navy again, little navy, but a navy. Um, yeah, Austria, bloodless. Czechoslovakia, though,
Czechoslovakia.
different. Now, as we know today, because once they had a chance, the velvet divorce of the early 1990s, when the Czechs and Slovaks amicably, nobody got hurt over it. That's what's called the velvet divorce. Czechs and the Slovaks said, we're not doing Czechoslovakia anymore. You go your way, we go our way.
Everybody's happier.
We'll stay friends. And it worked amazingly well, especially when you consider the not so velvet divorce of Ukraine and Russia. Anyway, yeah. But Czechoslovakia was more ethnically mixed in those days.
Okay.
It had a large German-speaking population concentrated in one part of the country. So the Sudeten Mountains. So Hitler demanded that the Sudetenland be part of Germany. Czechoslovakia was prepared to resist. France backed Czechoslovakia. Britain was willing to back France. This is different politically. This is not Germany putting German troops in Germany. This is not Germany moving into a country like Austria, which isn't even sure it is a country.
And wasn't really willing or able, but certainly not willing to fight.
Right. Not willing to fight because they're not sure who they are.
We're not even sure. Right. This might be our army.
That's right. Exactly right. A genuine identity crisis, which the experience of World War II permanently clarified, but genuine identity crisis. So this is a different issue, though. The British are prepared to back France. Hitler is entirely willing to go to war. And this is the point at which he discovered that he and the army and the German people were not completely simpatico after all. He wanted war. Period. He thought this was the time. The army, to his shock, he thought the army was an attack dog, just straining to be released. To his shock, the army wasn't so sure. They had doubts about this. We're not just talking invading Czechoslovakia. We're going to have to deal with the British and the French. Do we really want to do this? Do we really want to do this now? Hitler was shocked and outraged.
They thought, even if we want to do this, we may not be ready.
Right. Two questions. Do we really want to do this? And particularly, do we want to do this now?
Right.
And Hitler was shocked. They'd be eager to fight. And he was shocked to discover that they're somewhat narrow-minded military professionals, if I can say that, somewhat narrow-minded, not really thinking about the big picture, but from a from the point of view of military professionals, yeah, this is dicey. And he didn't want to hear that.
And they were right. They may have been narrow-minded, but they weren't wrong that if we are aggressive in Czechoslovakia, we may have two other powerful nations
Exactly.
breathing down our necks
Exactly.
over in our western border.
Exactly. Uh, exactly. And he was shocked and angry.
Yeah.
He was even more shocked to discover, I think this is the moment when at this point, he had overwhelming public approval.
Okay, so this is 1937,
38.
38.
Overwhelming public approval. He had broken Versailles, which everybody hated. He had a string of foreign policy successes done without anybody getting hurt. Uh, the world economy was improving, but the German economy was improving particularly rapidly, partly because of all this military spending. Uh, Government deficit was outrageous, and sooner or later there's going to be an inflation problem, most likely, but not yet. Uh,
The checks weren't bouncing yet.
Checks weren't bouncing yet. Uh, they were very good at public relations. Every year there was a charity campaign where the Hitler Youth would come out and ask people for donations that would support various poor relief programs, always with the cute little jingle, public need ahead of private greed. Public need ahead of private greed. Nice little jingle. Then people liked it, made them feel good. They do this around Christmas. Big contributions to party sponsored charities, uh, construction of highways again, runaway government spending, but very impressive highways, yearly autobahns, development of a new car, the people's car, Volkswagen, development of a car for ordinary German workers, because like Americans, ordinary Germans didn't have cars. Uh, we're going to do this. We're building up a passenger airline service, Lufthansa, faster than other people in Europe are. Uh, Government sponsored vacations for workers in the Strength Through Joy program. Sounds almost like a papal encyclical. Anyway, Strength Through Joy.
Oh my gosh.
Very popular and outrageously successful 1936 Olympics.
Hmm.
I've got a good book about it. It's very interesting. Again, at this stage in his career, 36, he was capable of being quite canny. He never apologized for his anti-Semitism, never took it back. Around the Olympics, though, doesn't talk about it. Wants to make sure that when the world comes to Berlin, the world has fun. And by and large, it did. There were even political prisoners who were athletes were released to participate in the games. There was one German wrestler who was a devout communist. Not that I like communists, but he was in a concentration camp because of his communism, but he was a darn good wrestler. So he was a German. He gave Germany a shot for a gold medal in his weight category. So let him out to wrestle. His plan was that when he got the gold medal, instead of doing the Nazi salute, he would do the communist salute, the clenched fist. I hate the clenched fist. And the people who like to do that logo, if they know it's the old communist salute, makes me want to. Anyway,
Use your own clenched fist.
yeah. Anyway, that was his plan. He didn't do it because the rules for Olympic wrestling, until the Olympic Committee, just in the past decade, decided to get serious with the international wrestling people. And so your rules are incomprehensible to normal human beings. Uh, you need to change them to make this sport watchable, or it's no longer in the Olympics. Anyway, because of those bizarre rules, he did not, despite being the better wrestler, did not get his gold medal. Now that's a digression, isn't it? 36 games,
36. Everyone had fun.
36 Olympics. Everybody had fun. People liked it. And the Germans took home the gold in
They were the medal leader.
Oh, by far. Everybody was happy. Not everybody, but overwhelming popular support.
Yep.
Turning point, 38.
38.
He wanted war. The American correspondent Shearer in Rise and Decline of the Third Reich describes this beautifully. He had a big military parade in Berlin, and the Berliners did not show up, which, in the circumstances of a one-party police state, this was as daring a political protest as people could have. And I think this is the moment when the almost romantic relationship between Hitler and the majority of the German people began to unravel. He realized they are not into war.
They want me for they want me for what I can give them.
They want me for what I can give them. Yes, they want good things without suffering. Yes, I think that's the moment. That's the turning point. He wanted war. The army didn't. The German people didn't. And partly through Goering, it sounds bizarre to say this, but he was often recognized as the most reasonable of the inner circle.
Ah,
But I think this is the last occasion when Goering could actually move Hitler. After this, he was intimidated too, because Hitler was very unhappy. But Goering manipulated Hitler into actually agreeing to the Munich settlement, uh, which historians remember as a failure for the Western Allies, but which Hitler himself considered a failure for him. He wanted war. The settlement was very simple. The Germans would get Sudetenland, which was chock full of German-speaking people anyway. So Germans would get Sudetenland. They'd promised not to bother the rest of Czechoslovakia.
but didn't they evict all the non-German
Well, they
speaking?
did.
So
But
just people were just told, yeah, you don't speak German? No,
yeah,
leave.
and the Czechs returned the favor after the war when the Sudeten Germans were unceremoniously and often homicidally expelled. But you can understand one can understand why the Czechs are angry. But anyway, ethnic cleansing, no matter who does it, ugly thing. Two wrongs never make a right. But
Hmm.
yes, but the Western Allies thought that was reasonable. That way, you have a Czechoslovakia that's Czech and Slovak. Uh, Not that they were terribly in love with each other. Czechoslovakia was another one of the Versailles era's not brilliant ideas, along with Yugoslavia. But anyway,
Hmm.
problem was giving Sudetenland to the Germans meant that Czechoslovakia lost most of its fortifications because that was the border region that the Sudeten Germans lived in. So
Hmm.
Czechoslovakia had lost its ability to defend itself was considerably degraded. Uh, the Western Allies thought it was a reasonable settlement, particularly because Chamberlain was told by the Royal Air Force, we've got something called radar coming online, but we don't have it yet. And we've got a great new fighter coming online, but we don't have it yet.
That was the Spitfire?
Spitfire. So right now, we're not sure we can defend Britain. Well, people abuse Chamberlain, but I feel a certain amount of sympathy for him. If your Air Force tells you, right now, we're not sure we can defend Britain, you might be inclined
To make some
to
concessions.
make some concessions. Uh, in any case, the Western Allies were pleased. They thought there was a reasonable settlement. The German people were pleased. To them, this looked like another success without anyone getting hurt.
Ah,
Hitler was not pleased.
and that was the end.
That was the end. The beginning of the end, I should say. The beginning of the end. His relationship with the army began to unravel. He knew that, so with cannot, bizarre story, but he discovered that the defense minister had married a woman who was a prostitute in the past. So
Hmm.
he was able to use this to force out the defense minister. And somewhat outrageously, Hitler, already president and chancellor, was now defense minister as well, which is
A
too
job
many.
for which he was not qualified.
Job for which he was not qualified. And the German war effort would suffer from that. There was still the military high command, but yeah, the defense minister was now himself.
Hmm. As chancellor, he was commander in chief,
As
or
president, he was
as
commander in
president, he
chief.
was okay. And then but then he also became the defense minister,
Yes,
which means he had more control over day-to-day operations of the
yes,
army and the armed forces
the armed
generally.
forces generally.
Ah, I have more questions. Let's take a quick break.
No, design. Nothing will take that away. That's geography. Los Angeles doesn't have that. It's a port, but not a port like that. New York can't be replaced. New York can't be replaced. Los Angeles as a port can be replaced.
I was curious about Buenos Aires because I was surprised to learn that the people there refer to themselves as porteños. Like we were like the port city people, right? Do you know much about the anything particular about the port features of that city?
No, I don't.
I could see that, yes, it's a sort of a semi-protected body of water, but I don't have any more insight than that.
Just that's gave birth to Argentina.
Yeah. Should we go again?
Oh,
all right.
Drink my scotch.
Have another scotch. Okay. Where were we? Czechoslovakia, 1938. The end of the romance between
Hitler and the German people.
Okay. So interesting.
Disappointed in them. They were not yet disappointed in him.
Mm.
They thought this was another tremendous success, which really it was. Bloodless acquisition of strategic importance. They gave credit to him for it. So they weren't disillusioned with him yet. He began to be disillusioned with them. They were not eager to fight.
The army specifically and the people more generally.
Exactly.
Gotcha.
He was astonished that the army wasn't eager to fight.
This probably is what began his decreasing willingness to appear in public and to appear at rallies, correct?
Began it, yes.
Because do I really want to go try to convince people of things they should be eager to do?
Exactly. He still made a lot of public appearances, but yeah, that began to decline.
Mm-hmm.
As his health began to decline, as his sanity began to decline. I keep repeating this, never a good man. I don't want to be misunderstood on that point.
Yeah.
But not always a lunatic. But his slide into being a lunatic, I think it begins about now. Late 1938.
Okay. So then
slide. It's gradual. Actually kind of quick when you think, another 6 years, he was a lunatic.
Right.
That's not a lot of time, but it wasn't instant.
Sure. I think you said to me one time that it's basically summarized as up until that point, he had more hits than misses.
That's a good way to put it.
And then afterwards, he started having more misses than hits.
I would say up until summer of 1940.
Oh, all the way till 9. Okay.
He was still, I think there was a slide begins here, but he was still batting better than 50.
Mm-hmm. Right.
At that point. Still doing that. So, even the war, which he welcomed, again, was not accompanied, the outbreak of the war was not accompanied by by expressions of vast popular enthusiasm in Germany. Obedience, not enthusiasm.
Okay, and so what action is considered the first action of the Second World War?
Invasion of Poland.
The invasion of Poland.
The running sore of Danzig needed to be settled. But before then, he had violated his promise at Munich. So you get Sudetenland, you leave the rest of Czechoslovakia alone. He did not leave it alone. And ruthlessly took over the rest of Czechoslovakia.
Didn't like the prime minister of Czechoslovakia have a heart attack in Hitler's office when Hitler was explaining the terms of the...
It could be very intimidating, which is odd. I say this, as someone who spent a good portion of his youth pumping iron, as they say.
Mm-hmm.
And someone as physically pathetic as he was capable of being intimidating, but that's part of the mystery of charisma. Kind of the negative side of charisma, the ability to intimidate, and he could intimidate. Not everyone.
Franco.
Oh, later on, he was meeting with Franco, and oh my, he did not come out on top of that meeting.
What was Hitler? Hitler met with Franco in Spain, though.
In Spain.
Yes. In Madrid?
Yes.
Okay. And what was his goal in being there?
So, war breaks out.
I'm sorry, if you just swing the mic, there you
war
go.
breaks out because the issue of Danzig. And if Hitler hadn't earlier violated his promise about Czechoslovakia,
To leave the rest of
to
Czechoslovakia
leave the
alone.
rest of Czechoslovakia alone, likely enough, the Western Allies wouldn't have gone to war over Danzig.
The supposedly free city.
Yes,
Yeah.
which didn't want it to be a free city. You know, the French, those in France who were against the war, they had a saying: "Die for Danzig." Are we going to die to protect the independence of a place that does not want to be independent? But Poland was insistent, uh, and the British and the French, they'd had enough. Hitler made a promise to Czechoslovakia. He had made a promise about Czechoslovakia, promise at Munich about Czechoslovakia. He had violated the promise. They were willing to go to war. He didn't quite believe they were willing to go to war, but it didn't bother him. He wanted war.
Wanted war.
I should have said this earlier. Why on earth did he want war? Was it an abstract desire to see human suffering? He was so committed to he was committed to his dream, and he believed he only had a certain amount of time to accomplish it. A lifelong hypochondriac, he was convinced he was going to die young. He was a man in a hurry, and the way to get things done in a hurry, he thought, is it was really very foolish historically. It's much easier, as Mr. Putin found out, it's much easier to start a war than to finish it. But anyway, that's what Hitler supposed. He's a man in a hurry. He thought he was going to die young. He was a committed hypochondriac who made himself steadily sicker by giving himself wholeheartedly to a quack doctor. But in a hurry, wanted war. German people, no demonstrations of popular enthusiasm at the outbreak of the war. They were obedient. The army was determined not to face a two-front war. Hitler could see that too. At this stage, he was still capable of being pragmatic. But I think that ability is declining. They could make a deal with, of all people, the Soviet Union. He'd always been a vehement anti-communist. Evil, evil deal. We get 2/3 of Poland. You get 1/3. You you invade from the east. We invade from the west. We'll do most of the work. Joe, Stalin, we'll do most of the work. So you can just sort of mop up in the east. You get to absorb Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia. And then you recognize that we call the shots in Hungary, Slovakia, Romania, Bulgaria. You recognize this. You get to move into Moldova. Take that from Romania. We'll accept that. And you can do something with Finland. Doing something with Finland turned out to be an unpleasant experience for the Red Army. But eventually, sheer mass told. Anyway, evil deal.
The Finnish resisted mostly through guerrilla warfare
Yes.
up in the mountains.
Yeah, frozen woods.
Mm.
The Winter War.
The first biathlon.
Yes.
Skiing and shooting.
A lot of truth to that. So that meant once Poland was crushed, at least the German army wouldn't face two fronts. So he could redeploy to deal with Britain and France. Poland was crushed pretty quickly, despite courageous Polish resistance. Very courageous.
They didn't have the manpower. They didn't have the technology. They didn't have either.
Not enough of either.
Hmm.
Poland wasn't primitive, and the Polish army was not small, but it was outnumbered. The German technological advantage has been exaggerated, but they had an approach, an operational approach that was new. And in particular, it was fast paced, really unveiled when they hit the West. And again, at this stage, Hitler was capable of being pragmatic in a constructive way, still hitting more often than he missed. Constructive in the narrow sense of achieving his goals,
Sure.
even though the goals were not particularly constructive. When it came to the invasion, the war against Britain and France, the army's original plan, there was a dissident plan. The original plan was a repeat of what they tried in World War One, which is what the British and the French anticipated. There was a dissident plan, and Hitler approved the dissident plan from Guderian. It was a brilliant plan. One of the classics in military history, the book Toulouse, a Battle, about the fall of France. Book from the 60s, but still, in my ever so humble opinion, the book on the subject.
Hmm.
Uh, the author summed it up by saying, seldom in history have you seen a nearly perfect plan be nearly perfectly executed. That's what happened.
Yeah.
An almost perfect plan, almost perfectly executed. And the effects in the British and French armies the effect was devastating. Almost perfect plan to convince the British and the French that the Germans were doing the World War I thing again. So go through Belgium, Netherlands too. They make that look very impressive, and they did make it look very impressive, including the taking down of the great Belgian fortress of Eben-Emael by a reinforced company of German parachutists. Just one of the astonishing special operations episodes of history. They made it look very impressive. The British and the French moved to meet the German army in Flanders, as in World War I. Meantime, the main thrust was going to be through the Ardennes forest. The French discussed the possibility of an armored column going through the Ardennes forest. They concluded that because not much in the way of good roads in the Ardennes forest. So they concluded that unless you had perfect organization when you did this, you would just end up with the biggest traffic jam in history. So the French discounted the possibility of it being done, but perfect organization. For the German army, this was a hold my beer sort of thing. Uh, so the thrust came through the Ardennes, shocked the French army, and things just kept happening so quickly. The great medievalist Marc Bloch, uh, feudalism, still a great work, even though historians have substantially revised their understanding of feudalism. Do you want to hear about that? The French medievalist Marc Bloch was a French reserve officer on the French general staff. He observed the French general staff trying to respond to what the Germans are doing. And the way Marc Bloch put it was the metronome at headquarters was too slow. French general staff, very hardworking. They kept trying to respond to the new situation with a new plan. But by the time you drew up your plan, the situation had
The
changed.
situation was totally different.
So, yes, the obsession, perhaps a bit stereotypically, I'd call it almost a Cartesian obsession with having perfect operational plans, bedeviled the French. What the Germans did was have a brilliant basic plan and then sort of let operations develop almost ad hoc. So you had marvelous improvisations like Rommel's famous dash with his Panzer Division deep behind the French lines, wreaking all sorts of havoc. Success. Now, France is down. Britain driven from the continent in humiliation. Britain would not submit, and I argue rightly not submit, to German domination of Europe. Hitler was incapable of peace on any terms other than that. Uh, the efforts to make Britain submit, the German army had never planned for an amphibious invasion. It was not equipped for it. Simply and straightforwardly. They didn't know anything about amphibious invasions, hadn't thought of it, they weren't equipped for it, weren't ready to do it. They tried to let the Luftwaffe handle it. Luftwaffe failed, the famous Battle of Britain.
And that was Goring's idea?
Goering, yes,
Goering,
he really believed it would work.
that the Luftwaffe could win the
Yes.
the whole fight for Britain.
Yes,
And that was a very costly mistake.
an extremely costly mistake, particularly costly for German pilots. But Germany could afford, although it's just astonishing how slow the Germans were to build large amounts of aircraft. What really hurt them in the battle, and the British were much more prompt in switching to heavy production, to production of large numbers of aircraft. Why the Germans were so slow is an interesting question. Anyway, but they could afford the loss of machines more than the loss of pilots. Loss of Battle of Britain, however, if a German pilot was shot down, he was shot down over Britain. So even if he survived,
He wasn't going back up.
he wasn't going back up. He was going to be in a British prisoner camp. It takes time to make pilots. And the Luftwaffe, which had performed so extraordinarily well up to that point, it never recovered from the loss of pilots. He was operating in Britain. They were at the edge for the most part. They were at the edge of their operating capacity in the machines, which gave an edge to the British in the air.
Mm-hmm.
They performed very well. The British government was not entirely candid about its casualties. Battle of Britain was, as Wellington described Waterloo, the damnedest close run thing you've ever seen. But
Just pause right there.
still a victory.
What would a German victory have looked like in the Battle of Britain? Like we've just we've destroyed the Royal Air Force, or we've leveled London?
If the Royal Air Force were destroyed, then a German sea invasion was possible.
Ah,
The Army made it very clear. The Navy made it very clear. It's a small Navy. There's not much of us. We cannot fight off the British fleet. The Army made it very clear. Well, in that case, we're not going to try an amphibious invasion unless the Luftwaffe can sink the British fleet.
mm,
Well, the Luftwaffe can't sink the British fleet as long as the Royal Air Force is operational.
yeah,
So the precondition for an invasion was the defeat of the Air Force.
right.
And the Royal Air Force won.
Ah,
Which was a huge turning point in history. They deserve their credit. Churchill's famous line is true: never have so many owed so much to so few. They deserve their credit. So
what gave them the tactical advantage? The Spitfire
the
was
fighters at the edge of their operational capacity.
ah,
They were not long range fighter craft,
gotcha.
and they're operating over enemy soil.
Ah,
So when the pilot bailed out, if he survived, he's going to be a prisoner.
he was out for the war.
Out for the war. Luftwaffe never recovered. Uh, Still remained formidable for quite a while, but it never recovered its former qualitative advantage.
Gotcha. Okay.
So at this point, Hitler had to find an alternative approach. And he dithered. He didn't know what to do. He dithered dangerously. He had several months to play with when the British Army was out of action, had to be rebuilt. The army, the men, the majority of the British soldiers in France famously escaped via Dunkirk. They escaped without their artillery, and without their tanks, and without their trucks, and without their supplies. The British Army was going to take a lot of rebuilding.
So they still had the men, but those men needed to be re-equipped. They basically got out with the clothes on their back.
With the clothes on their back. So Hitler had a window of opportunity, didn't know how to use it. So he dithered with different things until finally decided the thing to do is invade the Soviet Union. But as he dithered, one thing he thought about was, as long as Italy is going to war, which Italy decided to do, last time the Swiss guards are ever ordered to load their weapons. The Swiss guards then and now have serious rifles near their duty posts, concealed lest they shock the public. But they're not loaded. They're not kept loaded.
Are there magazines nearby?
They have the magazines.
Okay.
So the last time they were ordered to load their rifles
Okay.
was when Italy joined the Second World War. And the Vatican newspaper, L'Osservatore Romano, had a scathing editorial about this decision. The fascist youth gathered in Rome, and the fascist youth got so excited that for a while it looked like they were going to storm the Vatican. So the order was given to the Swiss guards to load their magazines. At which point the Italian authorities intervened. The last thing we need is a bunch of fascist kids assaulting the Vatican and beating up the Pope.
We don't need blood on the steps of St.
We don't
Peter's.
need blood on the steps of St. Peter's, so the police intervened. But little tidbit of history, the last time the Swiss guards were ordered to load their weapons at their duty stations. So Italy joined the war and underperformed astonishingly. It's still a little bit of a mystery.
Hence all the modern memes about the ineffectiveness of Italian fighting forces.
Yes.
Right.
And given the courage and determination with which Italians had fought in World War I, it's a little bit of a puzzle.
Hmm.
But that is
Another story for another day.
story for another day. Given that, Hitler supposed, if we could get Spain to join as well, that could close off the Mediterranean. So that's when he had his famous interview with Franco.
Okay, so just help us set the stage here a little bit. Franco is the dictator of Spain?
Francisco Franco is a dictator of Spain.
Communists, socialists,
no.
nationalists. What what is he ideologically in support of?
Ideologically, he was an old-fashioned military man.
Okay.
He hated communists,
Okay.
hated anarchists, didn't overly like capitalists.
Did he hate Catholics, or he was Catholic, or
Francisco Franco was a devout Catholic who considered the clergy to be 90% idiots. So he was a devout Catholic who routinely received the sacraments, but who had no intention of submitting to any lectures from clergy. As far as he was concerned, the soul of Spain was Catholic, but also the soul of Spain was the army. He was a military man, a very accomplished military man, who he'd won a civil war against the odds. He had better troops, but really much of it had to do with his qualities as a commander.
Okay.
Very calm, very level-headed, very unemotional. When word came to him that 3 years of civil war had ended, we've completely won. Senor Cadillo, the victory is ours. He just looked up from the paper he was writing and said, very good, and then went back to his paperwork.
Victory was not going to end the need for paperwork.
Victory was not going to end work. Very competent military man. In his way, a very committed Spanish patriot. Now, his way was the army was the soul of Spain.
Okay.
And communists and anarchists should be killed. In fairness, communist anarchists were pretty good at killing people themselves.
Right.
And their antics in Spain are bad. Well, so were his, but still, it irritates me considerably when people overlook the detail of the massacres carried out by the anarchists and in a more disciplined way by the communists. Franco and his people, they firmly believe in killing communists. There was a friend of mine, an exchange student in Spain in the late 80s, and he stayed with a family whose grandfather had been very elderly at this point. His grandfather had been something of a higher up in the Franco regime, and they watched on VHS, back to those days, they watched Rambo 2 when Sylvester Stallone is rampaging through Vietnam, killing communists. And, the old man, my friend, didn't think that this old Spanish gentleman would appreciate this movie, but he loved it. My friend asked him why. And he said, it's been since the 1930s that I've seen so many communists getting killed. Uh, so Francisco Franco had a recovering country, badly damaged by the war, but recovering, certainly had a tested army, well tested in battle and victorious, well tested army. Ooh, can we use it? They're going to be on our side. Francisco Franco is a prudent man, very prudent. Um, he did not act hastily. And German ambassador is making no progress wearing him down. So Hitler decided to try to do it personally. And Hitler could be charming when he wanted to. At this stage, the project was the end, summer of 1940, towards the end of his capacity to do that.
Mm.
Maybe the last time he tried to be charming to anyone. He could certainly be intimidating. That odd mystery of how someone so physically nothing can be intimidating, but so it was. Didn't work with Franco. Hitler did the smile routine, and Franco just sat there staring at him. Hitler did the ranting and raving routine, and Franco just sat there staring at him. And Hitler was out of ideas. There was a period of silence. And Franco said, so, I suppose the meeting is over. That was it. Franco was willing to provide some support, allow U-boats to supply from Spanish ports,
To resupply.
to resupply in Spanish ports. He was willing to allow that, the irritation of the British. The British didn't want to push. They were irritated by that. They didn't want to push. They were afraid Franco might go further. Because he went
Their official stance was neutral at this
officially
point?
neutral.
Okay.
British were very much afraid that Franco would go for Gibraltar. And with German help, they might take it. And that would close off the Mediterranean.
Right.
They didn't want to push Franco too hard. Now, Franco is well aware that although Britain in some ways is declining, still a power, still a light heavyweight. Spain was a welterweight. So you don't want to get smacked by Britain either. So he was not eager to join the war unless he had firm German guarantees of lots of stuff,
Lots of goodies.
lots of goodies.
Poor Adolf. Everybody wants me for my. Give them. Yeah.
So he was willing to do that. And once Hitler invaded the Soviet Union, he was willing to send one volunteer division, the Blue Division, very good troops to Russia. And the performance of the Spanish Blue Division is legendary. Still, it was only one division, and not on a front that had 200 divisions on one side and 300 on the other.
Did any of them make it back?
Darn few.
Darn few.
That was the most horrible conflict in human history and the largest, the Eastern Front in World War II. The decisive front. I once almost started a fight. So the defeat of Hitler had much more to do with Private Romanov than Private Ryan, but it's true. almost started a fight, but
Yeah.
yes, the Wehrmacht was worn down mainly by the Red Army in huge fighting on an epic, terrifyingly epic scale.
So there must have been people in the German army who said to Hitler, don't antagonize Russia. Let's take another run at England by other means.
No.
No.
The Navy suggested, Admiral Dönitz suggested, let's work in the Mediterranean. And I think that was a missed opportunity. Certainly that's what Rommel wanted. So I shouldn't say no one in the army. That's what Rommel wanted.
Let's work on the Mediterranean, as in we take over all. We take all French and English holdings on the northern coast of Africa.
Well, yes, the French holdings we can take any time. France is in a weird position. There are French troops there, but their allegiance is a complicated question that we don't have time to get into. But we can take Egypt. We can secure Syria. We can take over the Mediterranean. We can have access to the oil of the Arabian Peninsula. We can take the Mediterranean and the Middle East.
And it's easy. It would be easy.
Easy. British Army is a wreck. Their men escaped, but without their trucks, without their artillery, without their tanks, who got the chance to do this? So the Navy wanted that, and the Navy was right. But the Army thought in grand terms. And the Army did not do much to oppose Hitler's idea of invading the Soviet Union. It underestimated the Soviet Union. The Army knew it had accomplished something astonishing in the defeat of Britain and France. They felt sure they could do it again. And they were right. But when it came to the Soviet Union, you had to do it two more times, not once more. The Soviet Union, the initial Soviet army deployed on the border,
Mm-hmm.
badly deployed, waiting to get hit. But there was also a second Soviet army, reservists, troops from Siberia. Uh, so the German army had to do it all over again. They won tremendous victories when they invaded. Tremendous victories that were badly used. Uh, the civilian population was terrorized. Jews in particular, but not just Jews. Civilian population is terrorized. Ukrainians in particular could have been won over. Ukraine had suffered terribly at the hands of Soviet Russia. Uh, that's badly used victories. The German army didn't realize, and they were quite candid about this, they didn't realize that their intelligence was terribly poor. There was a whole second Soviet army to fight.
What could Russia have offered the Germans in terms? I mean, were there oil fields they could have accessed? Were there
Certainly.
other resources
Hitler was
like?
obsessed about that. He was obsessed about, unrealistically obsessed about getting to the oil fields in the Caucasus.
Uh-huh.
He was obsessed about getting to the grain fields of Ukraine, natural breadbasket.
Uh-huh.
Um,
But Northern Africa and Arabia would have been better bets.
Better bets because they were sure bets.
Uh-huh. And you could ultimately you could buy your grain and just go get your oil.
Yeah, well, the oil was there at the Middle East.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, Lots of oil in Iraq. A little bit of support. The Iraqi coup against the British could have worked. A little more support. Rommel could have conquered Egypt. Soviet Union was a medium-term threat, but it was not going to invade in the short term, and only the short term was needed. Yeah, so I think that was the strategic mistake, not just Hitler, though.
Okay, so the army did not have a clear sighted picture.
The army did not have a clear picture about how to win the war. It was Hitler's idea to invade the Soviet Union, but the army was confident
They could do it.
they could do it.
And they sort of did.
They sort of did. They did what they thought they needed to do. They didn't realize they needed to do it twice.
Hmm.
Destroy one Soviet army, then destroy the second one.
Hmm.
But after destroying the first one, because it went down fighting, they destroyed it, but it went down fighting. And then you drive a few hundred more miles into the Soviet Union as the weather deteriorates. Several hundred miles into the Soviet Union as the weather deteriorates. They have to do it again.
Hmm.
They couldn't do it again. There's a wonderful novel, happily translated into English, The Red Horse, describing the experience of a couple of Italian families and their sons in World War II and after the war, and the passages that describe their experience of Italian soldiers in Russia, are particularly evocative of the experience of victory, victory, victory. Then you realize, oh my, this isn't over. And then you realize, we're not going to win this.
Did the Russians drive the German army out of Russia, or did the winner drive them out?
The Soviet army drove them out.
It did. Okay.
Long, painful process.
Okay.
Could the Soviet army have driven the Germans out if the Germans didn't have another front, a lesser front,
Hmm.
but another front? That's an interesting question. I think unanswerable. Fact is, the Red Army won. German army did have other things on its plate. And the supplies from the West, I don't think, the West has never admitted that, to use my provocative phrase, the defeat of Hitler had more to do with Private Romanov than Private Ryan.
Mm-hmm.
The West has never admitted that. The Russians never admitted the degree to which Private Romanov could do what he did because of supplies from the West.
Ah,
Trucks. They didn't need our tanks. They made better tanks. But our trucks, radios, high octane fuel,
rubber?
rubber. Uh, but trucks, rubber, fuel, just plain fuel, high octane fuel for aviation. Um, these made the Russian army mobile.
Mm-hmm.
So yes, we've never admitted the sacrifices of Private Romanov properly. They've never admitted the degree of our support.
Ah,
Uh, so yes, I would say without our support, I don't think they could have done it. Nonetheless, it was Russian blood and vast quantities of it.
and vast quantities of it, which has always been
Russian Soviet blood, the other Soviet nationalities as well, and vast quantities of it.
okay.
And during all of this, Hitler became increasingly detached from reality.
And this is a result of the drugs that Dr. Morell were giving
Yes,
him.
building on his own psychological difficulties,
Mm-hmm.
he could not accept reality, and yet he added more work that he didn't actually do. So he was chancellor, head of the government. He was president, commander in chief, and head of state. He was defense minister, supposed to be handling the ordinary operations of the military. And after he got really frustrated with the army, he made himself chief of the army command as well. So he tried to take,
Which is like the Joint Chiefs.
yeah,
Yeah, head of the Joint Chiefs.
he's trying to do all this, and he's trying to do all this without any kind of a rational schedule. He liked to stay up late at night, talking, like I'm talking. He liked to stay up late at night, talking and watching movies, and then sleep ridiculously late into the morning.
Ah,
He did not like to have a steady schedule. Sometimes the great movie, The Longest Day, the greatest of World War II movies, in my ever so humble opinion, it addresses this, and it's a true story. Uh, because he lacked sleep, he was finally given sleeping pills, and he'd given orders that the Panzer Reserve in France is not to be released without his direct orders. But his doctor had given orders that he wasn't supposed to be awakened until he finished his deep sleep. So while D-Day was happening, the Panzer Reserve in France could not be released because it required his direct authorization.
and the culture of the German Reich at this time was no one could take the sort of risk of disobeying orders of that kind, right?
Correct.
You'd be punished for.
He'd be punished for it, most likely. There were some irregularities, but most likely.
Hmm.
And who's going to rush in and wake him up? Or who's going to say, we don't have orders from the Fuhrer, but you must spring into action now?
Because D-Day is happening.
Yes, now or it'll be too late. Would have been a daring person to do it. By this stage, the war was lost in any case. His relationship with the army leadership is shattered. And at this point, the loose knit and for a long time demoralized opposition to Hitler in Germany, it's beginning to recover confidence as well as urgency. We're going to save the country. We're going to save the country. We have to do something about him.
If we're going to save the country, we need to do it while we still have borders that we can reasonably defend.
Yes, well, we still have some reasonable capacity to defend.
Ah,
Well, the army is still functioning.
so that we could actually negotiate with the Allies.
Yes.
Right.
How realistic was that? That's another question. By that time, Roosevelt had already declared unconditional surrender.
Mm-hmm.
Eisenhower was shocked. Uh, he was also irritated. He thought he should have been consulted before
Roosevelt said,
Roosevelt made.
unconditional surrender.
But Eisenhower was shocked. He said, "I'm afraid this will increase German resistance and prolong the war," which it almost certainly did. Eisenhower's expression was, "They're going to prefer to die on bayonets rather than on hangman's nooses." Uh, so he thought this would intensify German resistance, and it did. Goebbels was able to play on this. The public was getting war weary.
Mm-hmm.
The public basically knew the war was lost, partly because they're getting bombed. Uh,
With no air resistance, only anti-aircraft resistance.
oh no, there's certainly air resistance.
Oh, they still had a functional
Oh
air
yes.
force.
But what the Luftwaffe had to do in order to defend the homeland,
Uh-huh.
it had to pull back from the battlefield.
Ah,
So the bitter joke among German soldiers in Italy was those Italian planes, those are English planes, those are American planes. Well, the new soldier asks, well, what about ours? Well, ours are the invisible ones. The Luftwaffe fought in the skies over Germany. It remained dangerous. Now, military specialists would say that the Germans overinvested in their flat guns. Is Allied studies, the Allied post-war studies revealed the flat guns, for all the effort the Germans put into them, did not account for many American planes.
hmm.
Real damage is done by German fighters.
Oh,
So the Germans should have invested more. The conclusion is more in interceptors and less in the flat guns.
right.
In any case, they took that seriously. And bombing Germany remained a very dangerous thing.
Sure.
Not mainly because of the flag, but because of the fighters.
Okay.
Still, bombers were getting through.
Yep.
Damage was getting done. German people were suffering. Casualties are horrible. Public is getting war weary. Increasingly, they know they've lost the war. The Fuhrer has disappeared. He doesn't make public appearances anymore. Very seldom even radio broadcasts. Uh,
Who was on the radio? Goebbels.
Goebbels. And unconditional surrender gave him a handle to revive the war effort, in my opinion. I don't think it was one of Roosevelt's good moves.
Yeah.
I think Eisenhower's a good soldier. He didn't say anything in public. And I think Eisenhower's instinct was right, that this is a mistake. It'll prolong the war. It'll increase German resistance. Because Goebbels was able to play with it and and rouse public resistance, hopeless resistance, kind of grim. But Goebbels' message was, they're out to kill us. They're going to wipe us out. So you might as well go down fighting.
They're going to genocide us all.
Yeah,
The Russians are coming.
exactly.
Uh,
And the Germans had misbehaved horribly in the Soviet Union. And so the Soviets, as they rolled into German territory, they misbehaved horribly. Horribly. Uh, I know a lady whose grandmother, Polish lady, her grandmother's boyfriend, so not her eventual husband, obviously, the grandmother's boyfriend at the time, teenager, he died fighting the Germans in the Warsaw Uprising. And then she was sent to be a laborer in Germany. So she had no love for the Germans, no reason to love them at all. But she was a woman, young woman, good woman. And as she made her way after the end of the war, made her way back through ruined Germany into Poland, she was shaken to her core by the things the Red Army had done as it rolled into Germany, particular things it did to women. Not so much, to some degree, the frontline soldiers, but it seems to be a consensus that it was the next echelon that really tore loose. So, yes, uh, given the behavior of the Red Army, given the message of unconditional surrender, given the Allied air tactics that increasingly despaired of trying for any accuracy and just firebombed cities. And then given the Morgenthau plan, this infuriated our State Department. Morgenthau was Secretary of the Treasury. And the Secretary of the Treasury emitted his plan for what to do with post-war Germany. Uh, the State Department was furious. Who the hell does the Secretary of Treasury, does the Secretary of the Treasury think he is? But the Morgenthau plan, he released to the public. The Morgenthau plan was the end of Germany. Uh, and released to the public. So Goebbels was able to use all of that to convince the German public to keep fighting. We're doomed. So we might as well go down fighting.
Hmm.
And that they kept it up until they kept it up until the very end when American soldiers were deep in Germany. And so were Soviet soldiers. Then resistance began to collapse. But it took a surprisingly long time.
Ugh.
And during all this, Hitler became increasingly detached, to puts it mildly.
Yeah.
This is where we come to the lunatic, the raving lunatic of the movies.
The favorite icon of our current understanding.
Right. And
culturally.
I repeat one more time, never a good man. I don't want to be misunderstood about that. Never a good man, but not always a raving lunatic. A raving lunatic would never have come to power. A raving lunatic would never have brought Germany to significant strategic successes for the war, and even military successes early in the war. By this stage, raving lunatic, detached from reality, seething with hatred against his own country. The army.
He felt the German people had betrayed him.
The German people had failed him. Some of them had tried to assassinate him, and the rest of them had lost. The German people had failed him. And he wanted a scorched earth strategy, blow up everything.
If we can't have it, then neither can they.
We can't have it, neither can they. Wow. Horrible, horrible episode in history.
Hmm.
I think often of the ordinary people who are caught in the middle of this.
Mm-hmm.
I knew, talking to a bride once some years ago about her family background. Ethnic Germans in Bessarabia and part of the Soviet Union had been part of Romania. Same country that my ancestors are from, by the way. They were also ethnic Germans in Bessarabia. But she told me her great-grandfather, ethnic German, Bessarabia, he'd been, after the Germans invaded, he'd been informed, congratulations, you are now a citizen of the Reich. And as a citizen of the Reich, you get to be in the army. So he was sent off to fight. Family never knew what happened to him. And as the Red Army rolled in, his widow had to decide what to do with her young children. Do I stay here and see what happens when the Red Army arrives? Or do I retreat with the German army? It's a young widow with her children, part of this long retreat of the German army. Other relative, by marriage, Latvian, same thing. The Soviets, when they took over Latvia, had murdered the lady's husband, my relative's great-grandmother, great-grandfather. They'd murdered him. The Germans moved in. He was a Latvian army officer, and they were all going to go. From the point of view of the Soviets, they were just disappear somewhere in the depths of the Gulag. German army moved in. As far as Latvians were concerned, no one killing Soviets could be all bad. But then the Red Army began to move. So this widow with her children, she had to make the same decision. Do I stay and see what happens when the Red Army shows up? Or do I attempt to retreat with the German army? She retreated with the German army with her young children through the coldest winter of the 20th century. What a time. Human misery on a vast scale.
With no ready with no ready provision for food or places to stay or
Exactly.
clothing that whole time. Just we're going to do our best
Do our best to stay alive.
because the Red
Stay
Army.
alive and get to the part of Germany where the Americans were.
Hmm.
This was perhaps our greatest moment in history. President Ronald Reagan was fond of quoting Pope Pius XII, who said, "It seems that at this moment God has entrusted the destiny of humanity to the United States of America." Uh, yeah, for both of these ladies and their widows and their children, treating through Germany, try to end up where the American army. They knew the Germans had lost, but they knew they didn't want to be around the Red Army. That suffered so terribly, but also inflicted terrible suffering. Uh, they wanted to be in the part of Germany where the Americans were, and eventually get to the United States. That moment, we, with all our silliness, with the, it sounds outrageous to say, we made our fair share of mistakes,
Mm-hmm.
but we were the best the world had to offer
Mm-hmm.
at that moment.
Wow, that's probably the best moment to end on. Yeah.
I like to think so.
Yeah. That's powerful stuff. Well, Father James, it's always a pleasure to have you, and
Thank
we really
you.
appreciate your historical insight and the level of historical detail you bring to these discussions continues to astound me.
Lots of reading.
Lots of reading. There's some, right, right. Not easily gained. Well, good. Well, thank you for
Decades of
coming. A
reading.
decade. It takes a while to build up a body of knowledge.
It does.
Yeah. Well, good. Well, we look forward to having you again soon.
Jonathan, thank Tom.
Oh,
Thank you, Father.
very good. That's it.
Good night.
Have you listened to our episode with the Marine Corps veteran?
I have not.
That I think would be worth your time. He was there for Operation Iraqi Freedom.
Uh,
His battalion were the ones who pulled down the statue of Saddam Hussein, and then he also fought in Fallujah.
ooh,
Yeah. So he's seen some battles. Yeah.
battles.
Many
Real
battles.
battles.
Real battles. Yes. Yes. And he wrote a book called The Passion of Command,
Hmm.
which is I'll get you a copy. It's well worth the you I'm sure you could probably get it done in 3 hours. Yeah. Your reading speed's pretty high, right?
It's
Yeah. I think you could do it in 3 hours. Yeah. I'm pretty slow, so
been to the inadvertent way. I didn't mean to, of course. If I meant to offend someone, that would be really bad. But a colleague of mine, he wrote up a letter for his parishioners. He asked me to look over it. I said if I looked over it, I said, "Sounds fine to me." I said, "Did you read it?" I, you read it that quickly? He said, "Well, it's not Aristotle." By which I meant it's not dense reasoning, but
Yeah.
he took that as a little bit of a oops.
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 I guess you probably successfully prevented you from having to read any more of his letters. Yeah.
This is true.
Right. That's fantastic. Yeah. A little bit of grumpiness can really keep much at bay.
Not even grumpy. I was just,
Done with it.
yeah, it's fine.
Right.
You said it needed to say.
Right. Sure. Yeah. Are you expecting to be told that this is the finest example
Exactly.
of
Is this the finest
example
letter
of
to
past
parishioners
right,
ever written?
right.
You said what you needed to say.
Oh my gosh, that's great.